I welcome you on a day which comes in a time which is beautiful when we look out the window and see the orange and gold and yellow colors shimmering in the trees. And yet also a time which here in the US has been shadowed by real shock and sadness, as we have witnessed in the past days incidents of violence that have caused great destruction, that have tragically ended innocent lives. And these shootings coming one after another in succession. There was the attack in Kentucky, in which two African Americans who were going about their day were gunned down. And then there were the bombs sent in the mail to a number of politicians and also to the media, to CNN. Then came the truly horrific attack on a synagogue, the Tree of Life synagogue, in which 11 Jewish worshippers were killed. And more recently, in Florida, there was a shooting in which two women were shot and killed in a yoga studio. So here in America, over these last days, we have been watching acts of great destruction, and our hearts are heavy as we begin today. Could we begin with a moment of silence for those whose lives have been taken? They are Maurice Stallard, Vicky Jones, Joyce Feinberg, Rich Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger, Nancy Van Vesem, and Maura Binkley. Amen. pray for the peace of their souls, and we pray for the consolation of their families and the healing of their communities. And in the same breath, we pray for people all over the world who are victims of violence day after day. And when we contemplate what is happening around us, we might see that it can be viewed from different perspectives. There's one perspective, which is that creation and destruction exist simultaneously in this world, as well as good and evil. And that it has always been thus since the earliest days. There have been people such as Abel and others such as Cain, that acts of evil have been part of the human experience from the beginning and are part of a world that is made up of opposites. And that just as there will be calamities, catastrophes in nature, so there will be calamitous acts derived from human nature. And that we have to live in this world, in this samsara, this world of vicissitudes and changing circumstances, knowing at any time that anything is possible and that the contraries of life will always exist. This is one perspective. Another perspective is that circumstances in our human world are products of society and culture, and specifically politics and public discourse, and that interactions between human beings have varied considerably from time to time and from place to place, depending upon the state of the society and the factors at play in the political world. And that from this perspective, change is possible. It's possible not only to see tragedies as part of the great cosmic paradox of good and evil contending endlessly, but also as part of a world in which we together create environments that we then inhabit. And so from this perspective, we can see that these last weeks here in the States have been a time of intensified rhetoric, and in fact a time in which anti-Semitic rhetoric in particular has seen a spike, and that this was so also at the time of the last election, and that there is a relationship between acts such as the terrible ones we have witnessed and the tone in the national conversation, and that which feeds that tone on the part of political speech and the agency of those who promulgate certain messages. These things tend to, in a democracy, these forces tend to intensify, especially at times of elections. So it's a very intensive time. And the rabbi at the Tree of Life synagogue himself drew the link and said that hate speech was responsible for what happened. So from this perspective, we see there's a political context for things and a social context, and there's a possibility for influencing that context. An election is coming up very soon, and we will all have the chance to register a vote. Now, that's a direct way of influencing the political process, especially if one enters it knowledgeably and seriously considers the statement that one makes in this way. At the same time, it's also true that the voters' options are limited by a system that presents two candidates who are themselves, in so many cases, under the influence of influence which helps to determine their decisions, especially related to the influence of money connected with lobbies and special interest and corporations that have an agenda. So in all of these ways, the political context is one that, while being influenceable through a vote, isn't completely alterable thereby. And there are other ways to also to influence a social discourse. Writing letters is one way. There are various ways of making one's voice heard. Although oftentimes the matters under discussion are quite complex and multifaceted. And so the loudest voices aren't necessarily the clearest or the ones that bring about, in the end, the most satisfying outcome. But in any case, there is this second context of things, which is the perspective that events such as the violent acts that we've seen have a context in society and in politics, and that we have a certain ability to influence that context. Then we might say there's a third consideration, and that is that not only do we influence the world by virtue of a vote or advocacy, but we also, each of us, influence the world through our presence, through our thoughts, through our words, and through our actions. And that these gestures reverberate. We create an atmosphere in the manner in which we relate to other people, in the manner in which we speak, in our gestures. We're all emanating a field, and that field vibrates and influences the fields of others, who in turn influence others, and so forth. And so influence spreads. And so even if one is, let's say, aligned with the very best and most correct political platform, if one pursues it in a spirit full of agitation and animosity and impatience, then that is going to reverberate and charge the atmosphere. And so Murshid calls attention to the spirit of agitation, this violence of temperament, this arrhythmic, unrhythmic misalignment that jitters in the nadis, in the subtle channels of subtle bodies, and it quakes and it broadcasts its fears, even when ostensibly pursuing the most reasonable objectives. There's an unconscious, fear-based edge of aggression that tends to spread by contagion unless one is very careful and very clear. And when one is under the influence of those kinds of causes, those influences, then unless one is careful, one can be infected. It's spreading through the sound waves, through people that one meets, through just a general tenor on the streets, and even in one's home through the different media. There's this fear, there's this anger, the sense of an imminent invasion is there. The sense that that one is under siege, and that the enemy is at one's door, and that one cannot trust anyone, and that there is an other that is utterly unlike oneself and unknowable and representative of all that's uncontrollable. That fear, whether that fear is projected upon those on the right side of the political spectrum or the left side, however one conceptualizes it, it's just this unease that can lead to great destruction. Of course, none of us can claim to be free of it. It moves in the world, it moves in us. What we have to learn is to hold it, to let it clarify, let the sediment sink down, so the feeling is clearer and more transparent. Let it sit, see through it, what's really behind it, what's at stake here. This is the task of clearing, of purification, of centering. And then when we speak, when we act, we'll be able to communicate a livingness and a truthfulness and a sincerity that in turn will spread. And there still will be hard issues that this nation and this world have to confront. The challenges of the world that we have created and that we inhabit are vexing ones. There's so many contradictions in our way of life that have to be worked out. But there's certainly scope to do that if we can overcome this polarizing, negative energy that leads us down to Gehenna if we let it. We have to let it resolve itself into light through witnessing, through clarity, through attention and vigilance. So here we are in a world that is volatile and sorrowing over the tragedies that are unfolding around us, and witnessing the agitation that is everywhere evident. We see, yes, the polarities will always be there. There will always be good and bad, creation and destruction. We see, yes, our nation is the product of its social and political forms, and we have a voice in that, we have a role in that. But fundamentally, each of us is responsible for our own state and our state is available for attention, for purification, for illumination. And that's really the work that exists for those who find themselves called to the inner path.